Good morning. Thank you for joining me today. This morning we'll be in Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 1 through chapter 25, verse 19. A man with crushed or severed genitals may not enter the assembly of the Lord. A person of illegitimate birth may not enter the assembly of the Lord. To the 10th generation, no one related to him may do so. An Ammonite or Moabite may not enter the assembly of the Lord. To the 10th generation, none of their descendants shall ever do so. For they did not meet you with food and water on the way, as you came from Egypt. And furthermore, they hired Balaam son of Beor, of Pethor and Aram Naharaim, to curse you. But the Lord your God refused to listen to Balaam and changed the curse to a blessing, for the Lord your God loves you. You must not seek peace and prosperity for them through all the ages to come. You must not hate an Edomite, for he is your relative. You must not hate an Egyptian, for you lived as a foreigner in his land. Children of the 3rd generation born to them may enter the assembly of the Lord. When you go out as an army against your enemies, guard yourselves against anything impure. If there is someone among you who is impure because of some nocturnal emission, he must leave the camp. He may not re-enter it immediately. When evening arrives, he must wash himself with water, and then at sunset he may re-enter the camp. You are to have a place outside the camp to serve as a latrine. You must have a spade among your other equipment, and when you relieve yourself outside, you must dig a hole with the spade and then turn and cover your excrement. For the Lord your God walks about in the middle of your camp to deliver you and defeat your enemies for you. Therefore your camp should be holy, so that he does not see anything indecent among you and turn away from you. You must not return an escaped slave to his master when he has run away to you. Indeed, he may live among you in any place he chooses, in whichever of your villages he prefers. You must not oppress him. There must never be a sacred prostitute among the young women of Israel, nor a sacred male prostitute among the young men of Israel. You must never bring the pay of a female prostitute or the wage of a male prostitute into the temple of the Lord your God in fulfillment of any vow, for both of these are abhorrent to the Lord your God. You must not charge interest on a loan to your fellow Israelite, whether on money, food, or anything else that has been loaned with interest. You may lend with interest to a foreigner, but not to your fellow Israelite. If you keep this command, the Lord your God will bless you in all you undertake in the land you are about to enter to possess. When you make a vow to the Lord your God, you must not delay in fulfilling it, for otherwise he will surely hold you accountable as a sinner. If you refrain from making a vow, it will not be sinful. Whatever you vow, you must be careful to do what you have promised, such as what you have vowed to the Lord your God as a free will offering. When you enter the vineyard of your neighbor, you may eat as many grapes as you please, but you must not take away any in a container. When you go into the ripe grain fields of your neighbor, you may pluck off the kernels with your hand, but you must not use a sickle on your neighbor's ripe grain. If a man marries a woman and she does not please him because he has found something offensive in her, then he may draw up a divorce document, give it to her, and evict her from his house. When she has left him, she may go and become someone else's wife. If the second husband rejects her and then divorces her, gives her the papers, and evicts her from his house, or if the second husband who married her dies, her first husband who divorced her is not permitted to remarry her after she has become ritually impure, for that is offensive to the Lord. You must not bring guilt on the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. When a man is newly married, he need not go into the army, nor be obligated in any way. He must be free to stay at home for a full year and bring joy to the wife he has married. One must not take either lower or upper millstones as security on a loan, for that is like taking life itself as security. If a man is found kidnapping a person from among his fellow Israelites and regards him as mere property and sells him, that kidnapper must die. In this way you will purge evil from among you. Be careful during an outbreak of leprosy to follow precisely all that the Levitical priests instruct you. As I have commanded them, so you should do. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam along the way after you left Egypt. When you make any kind of loan to your neighbor, You may not go into his house to claim what he is offering as security. You must stand outside, and the person to whom you are making the loan will bring out to you what he is offering as security. If the person is poor, you may not use what he gives you as a security for a covering. You must, by all means, return to him at sunset the item he gave you as a security, so that he may sleep in his outer garment and bless you for it. It will be considered a just deed by the Lord your God. You must not oppress a lowly and poor servant, whether one from among your fellow Israelites, or from the resident foreigners who are living in your land and villages. You must pay his wage that very day before the sun sets, for he is poor, and his life depends on it. Otherwise he will cry out for the Lord against you, to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin. Fathers must not be put to death for what their children do, nor children for what their fathers do. Each must be put to death for their own sin. You must not pervert justice, due a resident foreigner, or an orphan, or take a widow's garment as security for a loan. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I am commanding you to do all this. Whenever you reap your harvest in your field, and leave some unraked grain there, you must not return to get it. It should go to the resident foreigner, orphan, and widow, so that the Lord your God may bless all the work you do. When you beat your olive tree, you must not repeat the procedure. The remaining olives belong to the resident foreigner, orphan, and widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you must not do so a second time. They should go to the resident foreigner, orphan, and widow. Remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I am commanding you to do all this. If controversy arises between people, they should go to court for judgment. When the judge hears the case, they shall exonerate the innocent, but condemn the guilty. Then if the guilty person is sentenced to a beating, the judge shall force him to lie down, and be beaten in his presence with a number of blows his wicked behavior deserves. The judge may sentence him to 40 blows, but no more. If he is struck with more than these, you might view your fellow Israelite with contempt. You must not muzzle your ox when it is treading grain. If brothers live together and one of them dies without having a son, the dead man's wife must not remarry someone outside the family. Instead, her late husband's brother must go to her, marry her, and perform the duty of a brother-in-law. Then the first son she bears will continue the name of the dead brother, thus preventing his name from being blotted out of Israel. But if the man does not want to marry his brother's widow, then she must go to the elders at the town gate and say, "My husband's brother refuses to preserve his brother's name in Israel. He is unwilling to perform the duty of a brother-in-law to me." Then the elders of his city must summon him and speak to him. If he persists, saying, "I don't want to marry her," then his sister-in-law must approach him in view of the elders, remove his sandal from his foot, and spit in his face. She will then respond, "Thus may it be done to any man who does not maintain his brother's family line." His family name will be referred to in Israel as the family of the one whose sandal was removed. If two men get into a hand-to-hand fight, and the wife of one of them gets involved to help her husband against his attacker, and she reaches out her hand and grabs his genitals, then you must cut off her hand. Do not pity her. You must not have in your bag different stone weights, a heavy and a light one. You must not have in your house different measuring containers, a large and a small one. You must have an accurate and correct stone weight and an accurate and correct measuring container, so that your life may be extended in the land the Lord your God is about to give you. For anyone who acts dishonestly in these ways is abhorrent to the Lord your God. Remember what the Amalekites did to you on your way from Egypt, how they met you along the way, and cut off all the stragglers in the rear of the march. When you were exhausted and tired, they were unafraid of God. So when the Lord your God gives you relief from all the enemies who surround you in the land he is giving you as an inheritance, you must wipe out the memory of the Amalekites from under heaven. Do not forget. So, 3 chapters of sundry laws here. He who is emasculated by crushing or mutilation shall not enter the assembly of the Lord. When we read this term, it usually refers to the nation gathered before the Lord in worship, such as when they were gathered at Mount Sinai, but it doesn't always have this sense. Deuteronomy 31:30 refers to all the congregation of Israel, while Deuteronomy 31:28 makes it clear that all the congregation was gathered through all the elders of your tribes and your officers. So in some contexts, the congregation can refer to elders and officers. It may very well be that these exclusions from the assembly of the Lord are exclusions not from the religious life of Israel, but from the political life of the nation. Paul suggests that the idea of the assembly of the Lord is the leadership of the rulers of Israel. These people were barred not from the religious life of Israel, but from the political life of the nation. Trapp agrees, saying, "On shall not enter the assembly of the Lord, shall not go in and out before the people as a public officer." Clark adds, "If by entering into the congregation be meant the bearing a civil office among the people, such a magistrate, judge, and so forth, then the reason of the law is very plain." Isaiah 56, verses 3 through 5, shows that even eunuchs and foreigners could be accepted before the Lord if they would obey him, and they would be accepted before the normal people who disobeyed God. One of illegitimate birth shall not enter the assembly of the Lord. It is difficult to define exactly what is meant by the term of illegitimate birth. Some later Jewish writers define this as someone who was born of an incestuous relationship between Jews. Others said it refers to those born of mixed marriages between the people of Israel and their pagan neighbors, as in Nehemiah 13:23. In those days also saw I Jews that had married wives of Ashdod, of Ammon, and of Moab. An Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter the assembly of the Lord. The Moabites and the Ammonites not only treated Israel cruelly on their way to the Promised Land, but they also were a people with a disgraceful beginning. Moab and Ammon were the two sons born to the daughters of Lot through their incest with their father. You shall not abhor an Edomite. The Edomites were ethnically related to Israel, because Israel's brother Esau was the father of the Edomite peoples. Therefore, Israel was commanded to not abhor an Edomite. Interestingly, one of the most famous Edomites in history was abhorred by Israel, Herod the Great. Many of his spectacular building projects in Judea were intended to not only glorify his own name, but to win the favor of the Jews, who despised him as an Edomite. You shall not abhor an Egyptian. The Egyptians were also to receive more favor than the Moabites or Ammonites, because Israel was a guest in Egypt for almost 400 years. Though the years Israel spent in Egypt were hard, God had a greater purpose for them. Egypt was like a mother's womb for Israel. They went in as a large family and came out as a distinct nation. When the army goes out against your enemies, then keep yourself from every wicked thing. God commanded ceremonial cleanness among the army of Israel. Some occurrence in the night probably refers to nocturnal emissions, and the cleansing ceremony for this is described in Leviticus 15:16 through 18. After observing the ceremonial washing, he may come into the camp again. And you shall have an implement among your equipment. God commanded sanitary cleanliness among the army of Israel. Each soldier was to carry some type of shovel with which he could cover his refuse. Some ancient rabbis taught that the holy city of Jerusalem should be considered the camp of the Lord. Under this reasoning, one had to go outside the camp to relieve oneself. However, for many people, the trip outside the large camp of Israel was longer than what would be permitted on the Sabbath. Therefore, as a practical matter, the rabbis prohibited a Jew from relieving themselves on the Sabbath day. Really? What? Gotta go the day before? Oh my. You shall not give back to his master the slave who has escaped from his master to you. The refugee slave referred to had evidently come from a foreign land. Otherwise, there would have been legal complications, since slaves were a valued possession. A ritual harlot. This refers to a female prostitute. The term perverted one refers to a male prostitute, both of which were common among the pagan religions of the Canaanites and others in the ancient world. Later in the reigns of Asa and Josiah, we are told that the perverted persons, male prostitutes, were expelled from Israel. This means that for some period of time before they were expelled, they were allowed to practice their holy prostitution, which was an abomination to the Lord your God. You shall not bring the wages of a harlot, or the price of a dog to the house of the Lord your God. The pay of a female prostitute and the pay of a male prostitute were never to be offered to the Lord. This was a common practice among the sacred prostitution cults that abounded in the ancient world. A reminder of the principle that the work of the Lord does not need money from immoral or ill-gotten gains. That's for sure. Oh boy. Even in its most gross forms, this kind of practice has been allowed in the institutional church. And from Trapp here, and what a stinking shame is that stews and brothel houses are licensed by the Pope, who reaps no small profit by them. Written in 1659. Yeah, don't need church-licensed brothels. You shall not charge interest to your brother, interest on money or food. The mention of food and the similar command in Exodus 22:25 leads most to understand that interest was prohibited on loans made to the poor for their basic needs and did not prohibit the taking of interest on loans that were not for relief of the poor. You shall not delay to pay it. A vow before the Lord is no small thing. God expressly commanded that Israel should be careful to keep its vows and to fulfill every oath made. For the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and it would be sin to you. In many circles today, the breaking of an oath is just standard business practice, but before God it is simply sin. If you abstain from vowing, many wonder if vows or oaths are permitted for a Christian today. Some think not, because of what Jesus said in Matthew 5:34 through 37. But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your yes be yes, and your no be no. For whatever is more than these is from the evil one. But in context of the rest of the scriptures, we see that Jesus was not forbidding oaths, as much as telling us that we should be so filled with integrity in our words that an oath is unnecessary. Jesus answered under oath in a court, and God himself swears oaths. We routinely take marriage oaths today as Christians, and also have to go before the court and swear under oath to tell the whole truth. But if you abstain from vowing, it shall not be a sin to you. God never requires vows. Many times it is better to not make a vow. That which is gone from your lips, you shall keep and perform. This shows how important it is to keep a vow once made. As it says in Ecclesiastes 5:4 through 5, when you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. It is better not to vow than to vow and not pay. Many vows are just plain foolish. I'll never do that again, is a foolish vow, and it is foolish and unwise to demand such a vow from someone else. Of course, there's a vow we all can and should make, a vow to praise God. Vows made to you are binding upon me, O God. I will render praises unto you, from Psalm 56:12. So I will sing praise to your name forever, that I may daily perform my vows. Yeah. And of course, too, it's a vow made to do something unlawful is not a binding vow. Like in the case where you had, I think it was Jeremiah, and the people of Israel had vowed to offer sacrifices to the Queen of Heaven. And he was like, by all means, go perform your vows, but hear this. And then talks of judgment on the Lord, judgment from the Lord on them for their disobedience. When you come into your neighbor's vineyard, the idea is that as one traveled, they had the right to pick off a few grapes or heads of grain to eat along the way. It wasn't the right harvest. It wasn't right to harvest from your neighbor's field, but to provide for your own immediate needs. Yeah, that's why you had the prohibition that you couldn't bring like a container and fill it up for the road. You may pluck the heads with your hand. This is the law Jesus and his disciples were operating under when they plucked heads of grain and ate them, rubbing them in their hands. They were accused by the Pharisees of breaking the Sabbath, but not of stealing grain, because the Pharisees knew this law in the book of Deuteronomy. A certificate of divorce. According to these laws, divorce was allowed in Israel, but carefully regulated. Under God's law, the marriage contract cannot be simply dissolved as soon as one partner wants out. There must be cause for a certificate of divorce. Even with cause, divorce was never to be seen as a preferred or easy option. The Hebrew word translated divorce has as its root the idea of a hewing off or cutting apart. It is the amputation of that which is one flesh. From C.S. Lewis here. Christians all regard divorce as something like cutting up a living body, as a kind of surgical operation. Some think that the operation is so violent that it cannot be done at all. Others admit that it is a desperate remedy in extreme cases. They are all agreed that it is more like having your legs cut off than it is like dissolving a business partnership or even deserting a regiment. Yeah. Yeah, and it's certainly not a valid excuse that just want to go and find someone more attractive type thing. Yeah. He writes her a certificate of divorce. God commands here that any divorce be sealed with a certificate of divorce. In other words, it was not enough for a man to just declare, "We're divorced," to his wife. The divorce had to be recognized legally, just as the marriage had been. So, a certificate of divorce, a legal document, must be issued and properly served. Yeah, it's interesting to me. I was reading through the American Story by David Barton, and at least it came up during the portion regarding Andrew Jackson. But in those days, one had to have an act of Congress, essentially, to of the state Congress to certify a divorce, essentially. That is, it had to go both before the state's legislature and judiciary in order for the divorce to fully go through. She finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her. This describes the grounds of divorce and indicates that a certificate of divorce could not be written for just any reason. It had to be founded on these two important clauses. There had to be some uncleanness in her. Some later rabbis defined uncleanness as anything in the wife which might displease the husband. At the time of Jesus, some rabbis taught that if a wife burned her husband's breakfast, he could divorce her. But Jesus carefully and properly defined what uncleanness is in Deuteronomy 24:1. He said, "Whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery. Jesus rightly understood that uncleanness refers to sexual immorality, a broad term referring to sexual sin, which includes, but is not restricted to, sexual intercourse with someone who is not your spouse. The Hebrew word translated uncleanness, in itself, implies the meaning of sexual immorality. It is literally nakedness of a thing. This helps us understand what Jesus said in Matthew 19:8. Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. If a woman did not have a hard heart, she would never commit sexual immorality against her husband, and there would be no need for a divorce. If a husband did not have any hardness in his heart, he could forgive and still look upon his wife with favor in his eyes, even though she was guilty of sexual immorality. But because God knows there is hardness in our hearts, both in the offending and offended parties, he grants permission for divorce. In the days of Jesus, rabbis taught that it was the duty of a godly man to divorce his wife if she displeased him. Both Moses and Jesus makes it clear that God permits divorce in certain circumstances, but never commands it. He writes her a certificate of divorce. Most people think that in ancient Israel only husbands had the right to divorce their wives, and wives did not have the right to divorce. But what is said here may be intended to be applied to both husband and wife. Jesus in Mark 10:12 said, "And if a woman divorces her husband and marries another," clearly saying that in his day a wife had the right to divorce. Her former husband who divorced her must not take her back. This is a strong law, saying that if a divorced woman marries again, she could not return to her first husband. Should her second marriage end through divorce or death, to break this law was an abomination before the Lord. It seems that it might be a good thing for the first husband and wife to get back together, but this command is made because God wanted both marriage and divorce to be seen as serious, permanent things. One couldn't be married or divorced casually. It had to be carefully thought out because it was permanent. This law would also strengthen the second marriage. It would discourage a spouse from thinking they might as well just leave their second marriage and go back to their first partner. He shall be free at home 1 year. This was God's way of honoring and blessing the marriage covenant. He allowed men who were newly married to be exempt from military or other state service for 1 year. No one shall take the lower or the upper millstone in pledge, for he takes one's living in pledge. The upper millstone was something essential to a family's livelihood. Therefore, it was forbidden to take it as a guarantee for a loan. For he takes one's living in pledge. Non-essential items could be taken as a pledge, although interest could not be charged on a loan to an Israelite in need. A pledge could be taken, that is, collateral to guarantee the repayment of the loan. This command forbids the taking of collateral that would take away a man's ability to provide for his family and get himself out of debt. If a man is found kidnapping any of his brethren of the children of Israel, kidnapping was usually done in an ancient world not so much for return and ransom, but so that one could sell the one abducted to slavery, just as was done to Joseph by his brothers. The kidnapper shall die. The crime was serious enough before God so as to command the death penalty. And this law shows that slavery in ancient Israel was distinctly different than how modern or close to modern slavery was done. One couldn't just simply steal their neighbor and sell them into slavery because that resulted in the death penalty. But rather, slavery in Israel was something that was done voluntarily for a period of time, and that one was freed from every 7 years, I believe. Take heed in an outbreak of leprosy. Leviticus 13 and 14 describe in great detail how God wanted lepers examined and quarantined. Because leprosy was such a dreaded disease, God commanded here that they take heed in an outbreak of leprosy, so it would not become a plague throughout Israel. Remember what the Lord God did to Miriam. In Numbers 12, Miriam led her brother Aaron in a rebellion against Moses, and for it, God struck her with leprosy. Though Moses prayed for her to be healed, God let her be a leper for 7 days before healing her, and she was shut out of the camp 7 days. If someone as prominent as Miriam was quarantined as a leper, it showed that every other leper in Israel should also be quarantined. You shall not go into his house to get his pledge. When a pledge was taken for a loan, it had to be received in a way that kept the poor man's dignity. You shall not keep his pledge overnight, assuming the pledge was something to keep the man warm, such as a garment or a blanket, which would often be the only pledge a poor man could make. The pledge had to be returned, so the man could use it to keep warm overnight. The Jews in several cases did act contrary to this rule, and we find them cuttingly reproved for it by the prophet Amos in chapter 2, verse 8. From Clark. You shall not oppress a hired servant. A servant might be oppressed by not being paid, or by brutal or unsafe working conditions. God commanded employers to treat their employees fairly and kindly. Fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor shall the children be put to death for their fathers. A person shall be put to death for his own sin. God commanded that each individual be responsible for his or her own sin. A father cannot be blamed and responsible for the sin of their grown children, and the children cannot be blamed and responsible for the sin of their parents. You shall remember. If Israel kept remembering how much God had done for them, it would make them more compassionate and fair in dealing with others. We must always deal with others, remembering how much God has blessed and forgiven us. Amen to that. Reminds me of the parable of that man who was forgiven his huge debt, and then he goes and oppresses a man who had owed him a comparatively small debt. When the king heard about it, he ordered that the man who had been forgiven the large debt be thrown into the prison and repay everything that he had owed his master. It shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, regarding the harvest of the field. This was one of God's welfare programs for Israel, establishing the right of the gleaner. Farmers were instructed to not completely harvest their fields, so that some would be left behind for the hard-working poor to gather for themselves. This was a wonderful way of helping the poor. It commanded farmers to have a generous heart, and it made the poor to be active and work for their food. It made a way for them to provide for their own needs with dignity. And you see this done in the book of Ruth there, where you have Ruth gathering in the field. They justify the righteous and condemn the guilty. This is the simple responsibility of all government and courts. As Paul described the role of government in Romans 13:4, for he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. If the wicked man deserves to be beaten, apparently God considers that some criminals are wicked enough to deserve to be beaten. We seem to have a justice system today that considers itself more compassionate and kind than God himself. Yet we can't say that we live in a more just or safe society. 40 blows may be given to him and no more. Though sometimes a beating was the appropriate punishment, God also agrees with the idea that there is such a thing as an excessive punishment. And this was intended to prevent excessive punishment. Additionally, the beating was to be administered in the presence of the judge, so he could make sure the punishment was not excessive. Excuse me, dog. In 2 Corinthians 11:24, Paul listed this among his apostolic credentials. From the Jews 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. The 40 stripes minus 1 means Paul was beaten by the Jewish authorities with 39 blows on 5 different occasions. Paul did not receive 40 blows, as according to Deuteronomy 25:3, because as a common practice, the Jews only allowed 39 blows to be administered. This was to both show mercy and to scrupulously keep the law. 1 blow was left off to protect against a miscount. You shall not muzzle an ox. This law simply commanded the humane treatment of a working animal. In those days, grain would be broken away from its husk by having an ox walk on it repeatedly, usually around a circle. It would be cruel to force the ox to walk on all the grain, yet to muzzle him so he couldn't eat of it. Let's see here. And then God commands weights and measures to be just. You shall not have in your bag differing weights, a heavy and a light, nor differing measures, a large and a small. That is, essentially, when you're buying, you use the large measure to scoop out for yourself what you want, and the small measure you use when you're selling, type thing. Remember what Amalek did. The Amalekite attack on the Israelites is recorded in Exodus 17. In response, Joshua led the armies of Israel in victory over the Amalekites, as Moses prayed for them, assisted by Aaron and Hur. Blot out the remembrance of Amalek under heaven. Because of God's strong command to battle against Amalek until they were completely conquered, many see the Amalekites as a picture of our flesh, which constantly battles against the spirit and must be struggled against until completely conquered. When the Lord your God has given you rest, Israel was to make this war against the Amalekites later, when they were at rest in the land. Some 400 years later, God directed Saul to make war against the Amalekites, and his failure to completely destroy them was the primary act of disobedience, which cost Saul the throne. Anyhow, thank you so much for joining me today. Hope you have a great day. Bye.